April 1945. Somewhere in eastern Germany, the air smells of ash and wet earth. American soldiers move cautiously through the gates of a labor camp, their boots crunching over gravel and broken glass. The women inside do not run toward them. They stand frozen, hollow-eyed, their bodies barely more than shadows wrapped in striped rags. One soldier notices a woman clutching something against her chest, scraps of paper, edges torn and stained. He approaches slowly, hands raised. She flinches. He speaks in broken German, then gestures toward the paper. She shakes her head, expecting it to be taken, burned, destroyed like all the others. But he does not take it. Instead, he reaches into his pack and pulls out a notebook. Clean, blank, unused. He holds it out to her. She stares at it as if it were a weapon. He nods. "You can write," he says. "You can keep it." Her hands tremble as she takes the notebook. For the first time in years, she is allowed to remember her own name. By April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Soviet forces pressed from the east, British and American armies from the west. German cities burned under relentless bombing campaigns. The Nazi leadership knew the war was lost, but the machinery of the concentration camp system continued to grind forward. Even as the front lines crumbled across occupied Europe, hundreds of thousands of prisoners remained trapped in camps that had been designed to erase them. Women formed a significant portion of this population. Political dissidents, resistance fighters, Jews, Romani, Jehovah's Witnesses, accused criminals, and those labeled asocial by the regime. They had been scattered across major camps like Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and countless smaller subcamps attached to factories, mines, and agricultural estates. As Allied forces advanced, the SS initiated chaotic evacuation orders. Prisoners were forced onto death marches, brutal treks through frozen forests and bombed-out roads, with no food, no shelter, and guards shooting anyone who collapsed. Thousands died on these marches. Those who survived arrived at overcrowded transit camps, where disease, starvation, and exhaustion killed them by the hundreds each day. The women who remained in the camps faced a different kind of terror. Guards grew erratic. Some fled. Others became more violent, executing prisoners to destroy evidence. Camp records were burned. Mass graves were hastily covered. The Nazis knew what was coming, and they wanted no witnesses. For the female prisoners, survival had always required invisibility. Under Nazi rule, keeping a diary was not just forbidden, it was suicidal. Any scrap of writing could be considered resistance. Women hid letters, poems, and fragmented memories in the linings of their clothes, beneath floorboards, inside hollowed-out heels. If discovered, they were beaten, sent to punishment blocks, or killed. When American forces began liberating camps in April and May 1945, they were unprepared for what they found. Soldiers trained for combat encountered scenes beyond comprehension. Skeletal figures wandering aimlessly, corpses stacked like firewood, the stench of death so thick it clung to uniforms for days. Commanders immediately called for medical units, reporters, and photographers. General Eisenhower ordered that every detail be documented. The world had to see this, but the psychological landscape was harder to capture. Liberation did not feel like freedom to many prisoners. Years of trauma had rewired their instincts. They did not trust the soldiers. They did not believe the war was over. Some refused food, certain it was poisoned. Others hoarded scraps, unable to accept that starvation had ended. Many could not speak, not because they had forgotten language, but because words had become dangerous. For the women, the disorientation ran deeper. Under Nazi control, their bodies had not belonged to them. Their names had been replaced with numbers. Their pasts had been systematically erased. They had been taught that survival meant silence, that drawing attention meant death. Even after the guards fled, even after the Americans arrived, that conditioning remained. The act of writing had been one of the most forbidden forms of self-assertion. The Nazis understood the power of documentation. Personal narratives threatened the regime's version of reality. Diaries could become evidence. Testimony could become resistance. So writing was punished with extreme violence, and prisoners learned to bury their thoughts as deeply as they buried their dead. When American soldiers began offering paper, notebooks, and permission to write, the gesture seemed incomprehensible. To the liberators, it was a simple humanitarian act, a way to help survivors reclaim their identities, document their experiences, and begin processing trauma. To the women, it felt like a test, a trap, another cruel trick in a long series of cruelties. They had survived by erasing themselves. Now they were being asked to exist again on paper, in permanent ink. The psychological weight of that permission would take weeks, sometimes months, to fully understand. Angle 1. The psychological power of writing under the Nazi regime. Writing was not merely restricted, it was weaponized as a form of control. The camps operated on a principle of total dehumanization. Prisoners were stripped of names, families, histories. They became numbers tattooed on forearms, entries in ledgers, bodies assigned to work details. Memory itself became a form of resistance, and any external record of that memory was treated as sabotage. Diaries represented the ultimate threat to this system. They were proof of inner life, of continued personhood, of refusal to be erased. Women who kept journals did so at extraordinary risk. They wrote on stolen scraps of paper, using pencil stubs or bits of charcoal. They hid their words in straw mattresses, sewn into hems, buried in dirt floors. Some memorized entries and destroyed the evidence each night, carrying their testimony only in their minds. The act of writing was also an act of future thinking. It assumed survival. It assumed a world beyond the barbed wire where these words would matter, where someone would read them and understand. In a place designed to eliminate hope, keeping a diary was a quiet declaration of faith that the truth would outlast the lie, that the self would outlast the system trying to destroy it. When the Americans arrived and offered permission to write freely, they were unknowingly reversing one of the deepest psychological wounds of captivity. But for the women, accepting that permission required confronting years of conditioning. To write was to risk visibility. To document was to exist. And existence, under the Nazis, had always carried a death sentence. Angle 2. The American military response. American forces had limited training in humanitarian relief. They were combat soldiers, not social workers or psychologists. Most had never seen a concentration camp. Many had never encountered trauma on this scale. Yet they were suddenly responsible for tens of thousands of broken, starving, deeply traumatized people who did not trust them and could barely communicate. The initial response was pragmatic. Medical teams treated typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis. Supply officers distributed food, carefully, in small portions, because full meals killed prisoners whose bodies could no longer process them. Displaced persons camps were established. Repatriation plans began. But the emotional and psychological needs of survivors were harder to address. Some officers recognized that documentation was essential, not just for war crimes tribunals, but for the prisoners themselves. They brought in reporters, photographers, and relief workers. They encouraged survivors to give testimony, and, in some camps, they distributed notebooks, pencils, and paper. The intent was both practical and symbolic, to help survivors reclaim their voices and preserve evidence of what had been done to them. But the cultural gap between liberator and liberated was vast. To an American soldier raised on ideals of free speech and individual rights, offering a notebook seemed like a natural gesture of respect. To a woman who had survived years in a system where writing meant death, it felt surreal. The Americans did not understand the depth of the prohibition they were lifting. They could not grasp how completely the capacity for self-expression had been terrorized out of these women. Some soldiers grew frustrated when prisoners refused to write, misinterpreting their silence as apathy or stubbornness. Others became deeply affected by the stories they heard, carrying those testimonies with them for the rest of their lives. The interaction was clumsy, improvised, and often painful, but it represented a turning point in how the world began to reckon with the Holocaust. Angle 3. The women's internal struggle for the female prisoners. The permission to keep diaries triggered a cascade of conflicting emotions: relief, terror, disbelief, grief. Many could not bring themselves to write at first. Their hands shook too violently. Their minds were too fractured. The silence they had cultivated for survival had become a kind of armor, and removing it felt dangerous. Others wrote frantically, as if racing against the possibility that the permission would be revoked. They filled pages with names, mothers, sisters, daughters, friends who had died. They documented atrocities in meticulous detail, afraid that, without written proof, the world would refuse to believe. They wrote letters to families they did not know were alive or dead, sealing them carefully and clutching them like talismans. Some women could only write in fragments, sentences that broke off mid-thought, lists of dates with no context, single words repeated over and over. Their diaries reflected the shattered state of their minds, traumatized, disoriented, struggling to piece together coherent narratives from years of horror. And there was guilt, survivors' guilt for being alive when so many had died, guilt for daring to claim space on a page when others had been silenced forever. Writing forced them to confront not just what had been done to them, but what they had witnessed, what they had been unable to stop, and who they had become in order to survive. 4. The historical significance. These diaries, written in those first raw weeks and months after liberation, became some of the most important primary sources of Holocaust testimony. Unlike memoirs written years later, shaped by distance and reflection, these immediate accounts captured the unfiltered psychological reality of survival and liberation. The moment did not arrive with fanfare. There was no official ceremony, no formal announcement. It happened in scattered interactions across dozens of liberated camps in the spring of 1945, each one intimate and unrehearsed. At a subcamp near Leipzig, an American lieutenant named Robert Persinger walked through the women's barracks carrying a canvas bag filled with supplies sent by the Red Cross. Inside were bandages, soap, vitamins, and 20 small notebooks with marbled covers. He had no specific orders about them. A relief worker had suggested they might be useful. He distributed them without ceremony, handing one to each woman who approached. Most accepted them silently, turning the blank pages with trembling fingers. One woman, a Polish political prisoner named Zofia, refused at first. She shook her head violently and backed away. Persinger did not press her. He set the notebook on her bunk and moved on. 2 days later, he found her sitting in the corner, writing so intently she did not hear him enter. She had filled 11 pages. At Ravensbrück, the largest all-female concentration camp, liberation came in stages. Soviet forces arrived first, chaotic and overwhelmed. American and British officers arrived days later to assist with medical evacuations. A British nurse named Margaret Ritchie noticed women hoarding scraps of paper from medical supply boxes. When she asked why, through a translator, one woman explained in halting German that she needed to write down the names before she forgot them. Names of the dead, names of the children who had been taken, names of guards who had committed atrocities. Ritchie returned the next day with a box of composition books requisitioned from a nearby abandoned school. She placed them in the center of the barracks and stepped back. For several minutes, no one moved. Then an older French woman, a former school teacher named Geneviève de Gaulle, niece of Charles de Gaulle, imprisoned for resistance activities, walked forward slowly. She picked up a notebook, opened it, and smelled the pages. Clean paper, untainted. She began to cry. Within an hour, every notebook was claimed. Women sat on bunks, on the floor, leaning against walls, writing in silence. Some wrote in their native languages: Polish, French, German, Russian, Hungarian. Others wrote in the only language they still trusted, the fractured camp pidgin that had evolved among prisoners. The room filled with the sound of pencils scratching against paper, a sound that had been forbidden for years. The content of those first entries revealed the depth of what had been suppressed. Many women did not write about their own suffering immediately. Instead, they documented others. They recorded the numbers tattooed on arms of friends who had died, so their families might someday identify them. They sketched maps of the camp layouts, marking where mass executions had occurred, where bodies had been burned, where children had been separated from mothers. Some wrote testimony with the precision of legal documents, as if already preparing for trials they hoped would come. A Czech woman named Hanna Pravdova filled page after page with names of SS guards, dates of beatings, descriptions of medical experiments. She numbered each entry, cross-referenced events, created an index. She had been a librarian before the war. Organization was her way of reclaiming control. Others wrote letters they knew would never be sent. A young Jewish woman from Hungary addressed her diary entries to her mother, killed in the gas chambers at Auschwitz 6 months earlier. She wrote about the weather, about the kindness of an American medic, about the strange taste of white bread after years of watery soup. She wrote as if her mother could still hear her, as if the act of writing could bridge the space between the living and the dead. For some, the breakthrough came not in words, but in silence. A German political prisoner named Käthe Leichter, imprisoned for socialist activism, accepted a notebook but could not bring herself to write in it for 3 weeks. She carried it everywhere, unopened. Then one morning, she began to draw. Not scenes from the camp, but memories from before. Her daughter's face, the window of her apartment in Vienna, a tree that had grown outside her childhood home. She filled the notebook with sketches, never writing a single word. It was enough. The psychological shift was profound. For years, these women had been forced to live entirely in the present. The past was too painful to remember. The future was unimaginable. Survival required a kind of mental narrowing, a focus only on the next hour, the next task, the next roll call. The diaries reopened time. They allowed memory to exist again. They made it possible to think beyond the perimeter fence. But the act of writing also triggered breakdowns. Some women could not stop once they started, writing until their hands cramped and bled, filling notebooks in days, demanding more paper with desperate urgency. Others collapsed after a single entry, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions they had spent years suppressing. Medical staff noted increased cases of nightmares, panic attacks, and catatonic episodes in the days following the distribution of notebooks. Yet the diaries also became anchors. In a world where everything familiar had been destroyed, where home and family and identity had been obliterated, the notebooks became proof of existence. They were objects that could not be taken away. They were voices that could not be silenced again. They were small, tangible evidence that the self had survived. In the weeks and months following liberation, the diaries took on multiple roles. For the women themselves, they became tools of psychological survival. Writing helped impose structure on chaos. It created narrative where there had been only fragmentation. Some survivors reported that keeping a diary gave them a reason to stay alert, to engage with the world again, to mark the passage of days in a way that felt purposeful rather than empty. For Allied officials and relief organizations, the diaries became critical documentation. War crimes investigators sought out survivors willing to provide written testimony. The detailed accounts recorded in those first notebooks, names, dates, specific incidents, proved invaluable during the Nuremberg trials and subsequent prosecutions. Prosecutors used diary entries to corroborate other evidence, to establish timelines, to identify perpetrators who had fled or lied about their roles. But not all diaries were used for legal purposes. Many remained private, locked away by women who could not bear to share what they had written. Some were destroyed by the survivors themselves, who found the act of preservation too painful. Others were lost during the chaotic repatriation process, as displaced persons moved through transit camps, crossed borders, and tried to rebuild lives in countries that had been transformed by war. The diaries that survived reveal patterns. Nearly all contained lists of names, a compulsive need to document who had lived and who had died. Many included practical information about camp operations, guard rotations, and prisoner hierarchies, details that seemed important to preserve even if their immediate purpose was unclear. A significant number contained expressions of guilt, confusion about why they had survived when others had not, and fear about what kind of future was possible after such devastation. Repatriation itself brought new traumas. Many women returned to countries that no longer existed in the forms they remembered. Borders had shifted. Governments had changed. Entire Jewish communities had been annihilated. Some survivors found their homes occupied by strangers, their property seized, their families erased. The diaries they carried became, in some cases, the only proof of who they had been before the war. Over the following decades, some of these diaries found their way into public consciousness. Survivors who eventually chose to publish their accounts often drew directly from those first raw entries written in the immediate aftermath of liberation. Books like Fania Fenelon's Playing for Time, Charlotte Delbo's Auschwitz and After, and Germaine Tillion's Ravensbrück were shaped by journals and notes begun in those chaotic weeks of April and May 1945. Archives around the world now house thousands of these documents. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the Wiener Holocaust Library in London, and memorial sites at former camps preserve diary fragments, letters, and notebooks written by female survivors. Historians consider them among the most valuable primary sources for understanding not just the mechanics of the Holocaust, but its psychological dimensions, how people endured, how they resisted, and how they began the impossible work of rebuilding identity after systematic dehumanization. The diaries also revealed something unexpected: the role of small acts of documentation as resistance. Even under the Nazi regime, women had found ways to record fragments of their experiences. They had memorized poetry, scratched messages into walls, hidden scraps of paper in their bodies. The permission to write openly after liberation did not create the impulse to document. It merely removed the threat of death for doing so. Educational programs now use excerpts from these diaries to teach about the Holocaust. Students read the words of women their own age, confronting the reality of persecution through voices that feel immediate and personal, rather than distant and historical. The diaries bridge time, connecting contemporary readers to experiences that might otherwise feel incomprehensible. Yet many diaries remain unpublished, locked in private collections or family archives. Some survivors pass them to their children with instructions not to open them until after their deaths. Others kept them hidden entirely, never speaking about what they contained. The silence surrounding these documents is itself a form of testimony, evidence of trauma so profound that even decades later, the words written in those first days of freedom remained too painful to share. There is a particular weight to blank pages offered to someone who has been forbidden to exist. The notebooks distributed by American soldiers in the spring of 1945 were not merely tools for documentation. They were invitations back into humanity. They represented a radical reversal, from a world where identity was a crime to one where it could be claimed again, in ink, in permanent record. The women who accepted those diaries did not do so easily. They carried years of conditioning that told them visibility meant death, that memory was dangerous, that words could be used against them. To write required an act of courage, as profound as any they had summoned during their imprisonment. It meant choosing to be seen again, to be heard, to insist that their lives had meaning beyond the numbers tattooed on their arms. Today, those diaries remain. They sit in archives, in libraries, in the hands of descendants who never met the women who wrote them. They speak across decades with clarity that has not dimmed. They remind us that the human need to record, to testify, to leave a mark on the world is not easily extinguished, even by systems designed specifically to erase it. The permission to keep a diary was not the end of trauma. It was barely the beginning of recovery, but it was a threshold, a line crossed. A moment when women who had been told they were worthless decided, slowly and painfully, to write themselves back into existence. In doing so, they ensured that the truth would outlast the lie, that memory would outlast silence, and that their voices, once forbidden, would echo forward into a future they fought to reach.